Sometime late in April or early in May in 1925, perhaps it was even on this day 50 years ago, Ernest Hemingway met F. Scott Fitzgerald at the Dingo Bar in Paris, and it was the beginning of a most interesting, curious, and troubled friendship. The Fitzgerald-Hemingway relationship is our subject at Round Table tonight, part 3 of a special series on the legend of Ernest Hemingway. I'm Harold Hayes, and our guests are Scottie Fitzgerald Smith and Mathew Bruckley. Scottie Smith is the daughter of F. Scott Fitzgerald and collaborator with Mr. Bruckley on The Romantic Egoists, an elegant pictorial autobiography of the Fitzgeralds. Mr. Bruckley's passion for both Fitzgerald and Hemingway knows no bounds. He is the keeper of every arcane scrap history has left us about the two men, and much of it is to be seen in hardcover editions he periodically publishes in his Fitzgerald-Hemingway Annuals. He's also a professor of English at the University of South Carolina. Welcome to you both to a subject that's of great interest, I think, to everyone, transcending really rather parochial concerns of literature. Let us go to that Dingo Bar meeting and talk about the context. By my recollection, Fitzgerald at that point in time was already a well-established, indeed highly praised author, and Hemingway was not much of anybody at that point. Is that correct?
I don't believe, well, I should never speak on anything to do with real knowledge of the subject because Professor Bruckley knows everything, but my impression is that Hemingway had not been published at that time. Is that correct, Matt?
Not in the United States. Two little privately published books in Paris. 3 Stories and 10 Poems, 1923, In Our Time, 1924. And Fitzgerald was, at that time, the author of The Great Gatsby.
And This Side of Paradise and The Beautiful and Damned and a number of short stories up to that point, and had been celebrated as really the bright young man of his time. Yet, from the very first, I suppose by his own testimony, and certainly by Hemingway's as well, he was awed by Hemingway. Is that correct?
Well, he seems to have thought that he just had this immense talent that he, funnily enough, seems to have envied. So, because the first thing he did was write to Maxwell Perkins, who was then the editor of Charles Scribner's Sons, and say, you've got to print this man Hemingway. It's very important that you do this. And he almost insisted on Hemingway going to see Maxwell Perkins as soon as he got back to America. And that really was the beginning, and there's a great body of thought which holds that that's why Hemingway never liked him. That he really hated, that he sort of hated the fact that he had done this. But maybe what I've said is wrong, because we didn't get into this much detail in the book about what actually happened. Is that what actually happened?
Close enough.
Well, he owes him many things. But is it not true, Matt, that at that particular point in time, Fitzgerald was feeling defensive to some degree about the fact that he made money by writing for magazines, and that this was somehow not on the level of artistic purity that he perceived, however correctly, Hemingway might have been living on, because Hemingway was living quite frugally on virtually no income, I assume. Or is that part of the romantic apocrypha of the period?
This is a standard position, which I disagree with. I don't think Fitzgerald was really defensive about his Saturday Evening Post work because he knew how good it was. Remember, Fitzgerald published 160 short stories in a working life of less than 20 years, and it wasn't in little magazines for glory. He was crashing the toughest magazine markets in the world, first Saturday Evening Post and then later Esquire, and it was not hack work. It was very high-level professional work, and he knew how good it was. And moreover, at the time of that meeting in the Dingo Bar, Fitzgerald had just published, on the 6th of April, 1925, The Great Gatsby, and he knew how good that was. However, you are right in the fact that it was a topsy-turvy relationship, in that the famous author, Fitzgerald, was immediately admiring of the unknown, Hemingway. Hemingway dominated the friendship from the start for several reasons, not the least of which was the fact that Fitzgerald was tremendously impressed by Hemingway's war record. Like so many of the World War I generation, I think Scottie, your dad never quite recovered from his disappointment at, quote, not getting over.
Oh, well,
And
that overseas cap never worn overseas was always his symbol of failure in life.
Yeah.
And so I suppose he was deeply envious of Hemingway for having, I mean, I don't mean envious in the sense of jealous, but deeply admiring of the fact that Hemingway had had this wonderful experience that he wished so much he'd had.
Well, did Fitzgerald ever show comparable admiration for any other young writer of that period? That is, was he a booster of young writers? To me, in completely modern terms, such a man is Gay Talese, whose work you may know. But he is constantly
Yes.
sensitive to what writers are coming along and looking for them and helping them and so on, as indeed Fitzgerald tried to do with Hemingway. But were there others like that at that particular point?
Oh, yes. Well, for example, well, a little later, he did this exactly the same thing about Thomas Wolfe, and nagged at Scribner's and never you must do about Thomas Wolfe.
Is that how Perkins wound up with Wolfe, Hemingway, and Fitzgerald all in his stable?
Thomas Wolfe was already with Scribner's, wasn't he, at the time? But
Perkins recruited Thomas Wolfe, but Fitzgerald enlisted as partisan. In brief, as you know, it is unusual for writers to be generous about other writers. Writers are usually intensely competitive, as Hemingway was. And Fitzgerald's record is a remarkable record of trying to help every talent he stumbled on.
I suppose if he wanted to go back to the 20s, the person that he seemed to have spent the most energy on as far as helping goes was a man who, of course, since has become a member of the Académie Française and is very well known in France, André Chausson. But André Chausson had never been translated into English, and he'd written a very fine book called Men of the Road, at least that's the French title.
Homme de la route.
And my father just never ceased to keep nagging Maxwell Perkins to translate it, and he did. And then he started nagging King Vidor to make it into a movie, which it was also. Was it finally made into a movie?
Well, it was a movie based on it was made, and there was some hard feeling over whether Chanson had been done out of his rights.
Yeah, there was a great deal of...
The movie was called Our Daily Bread.
This wonderful spirit of generosity certainly continued throughout his whole life towards Hemingway, even in the face of outright rejection, it seemed, at some points.
Every other writer. Ring Lardner became a Scribner author through Fitzgerald's efforts. Donald Ogden Stewart got his first writing job through Fitzgerald's efforts. And he always had a flock of young men around who he was writing letters of introduction for, trying to get placed.
Well, why then this curious development in the latter part of Hemingway's career? I suppose A Movable Feast was written in the 50s. I believe Mary Hemingway told us on this show the other evening that he would imply that he had no help whatsoever from anybody on Sun Also Rises, which was his first big popular success. And in fact, now the record shows that Fitzgerald had a very strong hand in all this. Is that not so?
Documentary evidence. There's a letter that survives, which Fitzgerald reports to Hemingway in detail on reading the typescript before it was sent to the printer.
Matt, back up and tell us just the background of this controversy. Am I not correct that in Movable Feast, Hemingway says that Fitzgerald was seeking the manuscript?
Pestered him about wanting to see it, and that Hemingway, wouldn't show it to anybody until it went to the printer. But there's clear evidence in the form of a letter.
He also suggested that he himself had edited and revised it.
But there is this surviving letter in the Hemingway archives, interestingly enough. Hemingway saved the letter for 40-something years, which makes it perfectly clear that Fitzgerald saw the thing in typescript before it went to the printer, and that some of Fitzgerald's important suggestions were accepted, mainly
well, there was
cutting the opening. The Sun Also Rises as we have it now, which opens with Jake Barnes in Paris, originally opened with a kind of travelogue describing weird types of the left bank. And Fitzgerald very strongly insisted that all of this preamble and Latin Quarter gossip be cut out.
Mrs. Hemmingway read the original paragraph opening of the book on the show, and then the final published edition. And it's interesting because it says here, this is the letter from Fitzgerald to Hemmingway, or rather from page 30, I began to like the novel, but Ernest, I can't tell you the sense of disappointment that beginning with its elephantine facetiousness gave me. Please do what you can about it in proof. At 7,500 words, you could reduce it to 5,000. And substantively, that's what he did, was just to lop off the front end of the thing, apparently. Well, let us carry on this friendship and I suppose this gradual erosion over the years. Would you not say? There was the famous Morley Callahan story. Who can tell us about that?
The professor.
Scottie, you were at this point in time, I suppose, really a tadpole, weren't you?
I was very, very young. In 1925, I was 4, to be exact.
Yeah.
And it's my impression that a great deal of the arguing, of the deep feeling of animosity, of Hemingway to my father was to do with my mother. I have the feeling that my father rather resented the fact that he felt that my mother was crazy, as she put it, as he put it. And I think that my father resented that. I think that was a problem too,
well,
don't you?
It worked the other way. Hemingway was accustomed to being surrounded by adoring people. He was a kind of god of the left bank. And apparently your mother took one look at him and said he's a phony. And she used the word bogus. She used the word bogus. Yeah. And if we weren't on television, I could quote her great remark about The Sun Also Rises.
I suppose in those days, every remark got back, didn't it? It must have been rather like a small town in Paris in the 20s and for Americans.
I'm sure that Hemingway disliked having this one doubter in the mob of adorers.
Yeah.
Well, then, of course, the two stars took their own parabolas. Hemingway's rising much higher just through popular acceptance, I suppose, with Sun Also Rises and Farewell to Arms. Did I not read that Farewell to Arms sold 93,000 copies in hardbook, which is an immense sale in those days, whereas The Great Gatsby was, what, about 10 or 12,000?
23,000.
23,000. In any case, Hemingway, having been the unknown, now became the giant, and Fitzgerald's reputation began to diminish to some degree. But their friendship also began to diminish.
Well, one of his saddest lines, I think, and again, after all, the professor does teach this, you see, very frequently, so he refreshes his mind, whereas I haven't really studied anything since we got out the book a long time ago, or 6 months ago. Yeah. But certainly one of his, I think, saddest and really in a funny way most beautiful lines is, Ernest, you speak with the authority of success while I speak with the authority of failure.
Where did that, was that in the crack up?
It's in his notebooks.
In his notebooks. But he had made it known also by implication in the crack-up that he felt that Hemingway's talent had been nurtured properly and he hadn't nurtured his own. Is that not so? Was there an implication there?
I think if we're going to complete the story of FSF and Hemingway, that the professor here has to tell how the famous controversy came out about the line about the rich being very different from you and me, because that's the most frequently quoted.
The episode that broke the friendship was the Esquire story, Snows of Kilimanjaro, where Hemingway referred to poor Scott Fitzgerald, and that's an exact quote, and his romantic...
It was the whole name, it wasn't just poor Scott.
No, yeah. Poor Scott Fitzgerald, and his romantic awe of the rich. And he said that somebody, when Scott believed that the very rich are different from you and me, and when somebody told him, yes, they have more money, he didn't think it was funny, and he never recovered from his disappointment in the rich. And Fitzgerald was, of course, outraged, hurt, pained more than outraged at this betrayal, and wrote to Hemingway, asking Hemingway to please leave his name out of future fiction, and Hemingway wrote back rather truculently. However, the background on this is really surprising because there is a letter by Maxwell Perkins describing a lunch that he hosted at which Hemingway was present. And Hemingway said at this lunch, I'm beginning to learn about the rich. They're different from us. And someone at table crushed Hemingway with the remark, yes, they have more money. And assuming that Perkins is a trustworthy reporter, and there's no reason not to trust his account of it, apparently Hemingway had to work off this put down in the language of the 70s by attributing it to someone else with Fitzgerald as the victim. However, that is probably the single most famous anecdote about their friendship. Hemingway's famous, crushing remark to Fitzgerald, yes, they have more money. Except Hemingway didn't say it to Fitzgerald. Someone said it to Hemingway.
Do we know who that was?
From the letter, from Perkins' letter, it seems clear that a lady critic named Mary Colum, C-O-L-U-M, was the one who delivered the blow.
Well, Hemingway put that in the story also, according to a couple biographers, because of the crack-up, wasn't it? That is, he read the crack-up and the other related pieces in which Fitzgerald was trying to deal with his own unhappiness.
When Hemingway was rebuked by mutual friends for this poor Scott Fitzgerald remark in The Snows of Kilimanjaro, he said in his defense that he had been so appalled by Fitzgerald's crack-up essays in Esquire that he planted this remark in Snows of Kilimanjaro to shock Fitzgerald out of his self-pity.
There is extant a letter of Hemingway to Fitzgerald suggesting that he straighten up and fly right, and the terms that he suggested was be more like me. Do you know that particular letter?
Well, I believe that my father had written him. Well, as a matter of fact, we have the letter in the book. But he wrote to Hemingway saying, "Just lay off me in print, please. I don't think it's quite fair to start attacking me publicly after all these years. Can't we be friends?" A word to that effect. And then Hemingway sent back this blast about how he had debased the literary profession in print and so forth.
Well, Hemingway had by now become truly public property too, hadn't he, as far as his own notoriety was concerned, but also apparently at this point in time, as observed by your father, he had become quite vainglorious and taken with himself. And there's a very famous quote, isn't there, Matt, that from a letter or something where Fitzgerald says, Ernest has had his breakdown as I've had mine. He goes towards megalomania and I go towards melancholia. Mm-hmm. Isn't that essentially? And yet the relationship continued insofar as Fitzgerald was concerned.
It even had a kind of happy ending. The last document exchanged between the two men is an inscribed copy of Farewell to Arms that Hemingway sent. I'm sorry, For Whom the Bell Tolls. Yes, sir. For Whom the Bell Tolls, 1940, that Hemingway sent Fitzgerald with an affectionate note and Fitzgerald's reply congratulating him on the book. So after the bitterness of 1936, the wounds healed somewhat.
They had seen each other, or rather Fitzgerald had seen Hemingway briefly also, when Hemingway had come to Hollywood.
When
first.
Hollywood was raising money for the Spanish loyalists, he did an appearance in Hollywood, and Fitzgerald attended it, yes.
I don't quite understand how the wounds could have healed, though. I mean, how, if the wounds had healed, I don't quite understand why he would then have taken that new crack in The Movable Feast.
Well,
which was published much later. I mean, if they'd really healed, wouldn't he have been a little kinder in retrospect? No?
Well, one of the wounds healed. Apparently, Fitzgerald was prepared to, if not forget, at least forgive.
Well, it's hard to see how Fitzgerald ever wronged Hemingway at all in the length of their relationship. He was the wronged rather than the wronger. So what's to forgive?
This one hates to badmouth a genius. You know, Hemingway was Hemingway, and that's the important thing, his work. But there's a lifelong pattern in Hemingway's life which is inescapable, and it's doing the man no disservice to point it out, that from his earliest days of apprenticeship, he retaliated sooner or later, against everyone who helped him by some public disavowal. It seemed to answer some inner need that Hemingway had to prove that he really wasn't indebted to anyone. It began, the most outrageous example, apart from the Snows of Kilimanjaro episode, is probably the Torrents of Spring, in which Hemingway ridiculed Sherwood Anderson, who had helped him get started.
Your father apparently wrote in his, was it in his notebooks, that Ernest was always willing to lend a helping hand to the man on the ledge a little bit above him. So he perceived this, and yet this extraordinary generosity of spirit continued. It's interesting to me, Matt, and I would be interested in the opinions of both of you, of how we view this mano a mano today, because it was that, I think, to some degree. Both men sort of forced the comparison between them on the other, and how these two literary reputations have survived. Certainly they're dominant in our time, but you're the wrong party to ask, Scottie. Matt, what is your feeling about that? Gatsby, and what's comparable in the body of Hemingway's work in terms of novels? I would say Gatsby presumably is the great Fitzgerald novel.
And Sun Also Rises seems to be the one that has the most adherents. There are people who scorn Farewell to Arms, I don't know why, and for whom the bell tolls is certainly a major achievement. But I think that both reputations are stable and permanent. There are three great American literary reputations of the 20th century: Faulkner, Fitzgerald, Hemingway. And I don't think that Hemingway's reputation or Fitzgerald's reputation is going to be revised upward or downward.
Well, I read recently that 1 million copies of Hemingway's books were sold each year. I wonder which books today are most popular with kids. And you teach the course in the Hemingway class, or is your course concerned with?
Yes.
What's the most popular
They
book?
like Sun Also Rises.
That's their favorite. Scottie, did you ever meet Hemingway?
Yes, I did, but I was so young in those days, and my father had a whole repertoire of things I had to do. I mean, he sort of made a production out of me. He had a joke that he loved, which went, "Did you ever hear the story of the 3 eggs?" And then I had to say, "Too bad." No, wait a minute. I had to say, "No, Daddy," and then he had to say, "Too bad." And then another one was, "Did you ever hear the story of the 3 holes in the ground?" And then I'd have to say, "No," and he'd say, "Well, well, well." I mean, in other words, there was a whole little repertoire that we sort of did, almost like a little vaudeville team. And I think I was sort of trotted out, as I remember now. It took me a long time to sort of remember this, because so many people have asked me why I don't remember vividly the visits of these notables. And I think that I did a little routine, and then, of course, was sent to bed or supper or whatever, because in those days they weren't around that much. Everybody was in cafes and out in French restaurants and things in Paris. Nobody entertained much at home except Gertrude Stein with her salon. So I wasn't much exposed, and I have a feeling I was a doll when I was exposed and asked to kind of
Well, you haven't changed.
tell little stories. I didn't mean doll in that sense. I meant
Puppet.
a puppet, exactly.
Well, this is the conclusion of part 3 of our special section on Ernest Hemingway. Tomorrow night we'll have a visit from Lester Hemingway, his brother, who's also a writer. Hope you'll join us for that. Good night for Roundtable. Thank you all very much. I'm Harold Hayes.